Susie, thank you so much for joining Annie and I here on From the Mentor's Desk podcast. Just to set the stage for you and anybody who's listening to us, this podcast is really directed to early career or novice researchers who are starting out their career, trying to get their first big grant and to build an externally funded research career. So we're trying to educate and support. So we'd like to start by asking you about your personal journey to becoming a researcher. So what would you consider your main scientific specialty area, and why did you pick it?
So, it's very interesting. It started in college because I was a person that got good grades, and so everybody thought I would become a doctor. In fact, my mother is still upset that I'm not a doctor, but not the right kind of doctor. But it's really interesting. As I was going through courses in college and having work experiences, I was working with a psychologist who was interested in schizophrenia. And so she would do assessments of people for schizophrenia, and I would sit there and help score those, and realized that it was very difficult for me to see how much struggle these patients were going through. But it was fascinating what their brains were doing. So I very much switched from wanting to go to med school to thinking about research, and particularly research in neuroscience.
I will say Annie and I are both PhDs, and I will say for myself, I worked in a hospital in an intensive care unit being a telemetry monitor reader. And I'd make friends with some of the nurses, and occasionally they'd ask if I could come out and help them with a patient. And I would go into that room and I'd be like sweating. I'd be so stressed out. It was like
very stressful.
The noises, the machines, it would just, it was like a visceral reaction. I was not meant to be on that side of the desk. However, I was really captivated by the problems in the environment. So I was like, yeah, this is a cool area, but I'm not called to do that work face-to-face with patients. Okay, now let me ask you something, because neuroscience is such a cool area, like weirdly popular, except, it's always been popular, but it's so broad.
So it's pretty new.
Yeah.
In fact, when I was going to college, there were only 5 neuroscience programs in the country at that time. So it says how old I am. And so there were very few places to think about going to grad programs. And Oregon Health and Science University is one of those that was just developing it. So I came into a pharmacology department, but they had a program in neuroscience. So the area that I ended up really being drawn to is drugs of abuse. And so I study opioid, effects of opioids on the brain, and now cannabis on the brain. And because of that, have also kind of moved into pain, which is where the connection for DOD and the military really
is. Some of the attraction to that scientific area that there are sort of real world clinical problems to solve, or was it more like fascinating from a discovery perspective?
So when I started, it was the discovery. I'm an electrophysiologist. I study synaptic plasticity and how neurons in the brain are affected by these drugs. And it was very much basic science. How do cells work? How do synapses work? Very, very much into the details. But as I went through my training and had to start writing grants, that's where you have like, wait a minute, you can't get a grant without knowing what's the bigger picture? What are you actually trying to study? And the more I've done that and the farther in my career I've gone, being able to think about it in a translational point of view is really important. And so moving to this position here at the University of Colorado, and moving into an anesthesiology department where they're also neuropharmacologists. They're interested in similar pathways that I am, but they have patients. So having those conversations with the clinicians has really opened my eyes to how I could and how my research could actually be important for clinical outcomes and changing how we treat patients.
That's very interesting. It almost sounds like, we often think about, you have your research ideas, you have your potential clinical applications, you want to make an impact, then you go write a grant that sort of reflects that. But it almost sounds like the grant mechanisms themselves and the things they're asking you to think about and do, like tell me the long-term effect of this line of research, helps actually shape what you're thinking and maybe the mentors you're finding or collaborators.
Yes, I would say my early mentors were very similar basic scientists, and that's why I was trained to only think about what it was I was doing and signaling pathways, biochemical pathways, things like that. And I finally did have a mentor who is now director of the intramural program at NIMH, which is the National Institute of Mental Health. And she was fantastic at thinking about the broad impact of her research from the day I was a postdoc in her lab and started in her lab to now. She's the person that I most would like to emulate because, she'll ask these questions that are to any talk that she's in that's very like, bring it to, what does it mean? What is the broad impact? And she really opened my eyes as well as to a different way of thinking about research and science. So in terms of women in leadership, awesome. She's amazing. So
good. I want to come back to her. Do you have any questions before we?
I just wanted to clarify. So the NIMH mentor, she was your postdoc mentor?
She was my postdoc. Okay. She was at Oregon Health and Science University, before she moved on to become a chair, and then she moved on to NIH.
I often think some of the people I knew as a postdoc, either peers or, sort of preceptor type people, do move around over time. And, some of my peers went to different places and did different things, and they ended up promoted earlier than me. And then you could ask them for letters. You're right. They go to different organizations and they can share information with you. So it's kind of a small business, small world situation.
It really is. Yeah. It really makes a difference.
Yeah. Now, let me ask you one thing. You mentioned that you have done some of your work funded by military medical sources or of interest to military sources.
Yeah. So, my first foray into knowing about DoD funding was while I was at Oregon Health and Science. My collaborator had a Department of Defense grant. And that's where I realized it was a very different mechanism, a very different beast. And she was doing a clinical study on fibromyalgia in patients. And that is a very interesting story in that they were working on pain sensitization and central sensitization, and noticed they were doing recordings from the brainstem in brain, and noticed that when they flashed a flashlight on the rat that they were recording from, these cells would just fire. Only after they had a pain stimulus. So in this case, they were looking at a migraine model. And so in those rats, their light would cause them to fire. And my collaborator was sitting in a meeting with some neurosurgeons where one of them said, we never do surgery on patients that come in with sunglasses because whatever surgery that they would do would not fix their pain because it was already centralized. And she was like, that's interesting. The neurons we're recording from are also starting to, respond to light. So they started to look at light sensitivity in fibromyalgia patients and saw heightened pain in those patients.
So just because you have this mentor, and we don't have to go into this too much, but just briefly, you said, oh, the Department of Defense grants are a very different mechanism compared to NIH grants. Could you say, like, some things are the same, right? You need a population and an intervention and a hypothesis and an outcome. But in what ways, like, easily can you characterize that they are quite different?
So one of the things that I noticed right off is that they are very specific in what they want to fund. Like, there is a, kind of
a defined area of interest instead of anything, bring me anything.
And they're much more result oriented. So the progress reports are much more like, you need to do this you said you were going to do this by this period of time, and we want to see the results. Whereas the NIH grants are, we used to say they're grants, they're not contracts. So once you get the money, you do whatever you do with whatever the research leads you to. But the Department of Defense are, well, if it doesn't lead to anything, okay, that's the end, unless you can convince us that there's reasons to continue to fund. So it's a very interesting mechanism in that way. I think it's probably good because it does move research along a little faster.
Right, sort of like your example with the grant sort of prompting you, right? It might change some of the outcomes you propose because we need to show progress.
I also realized that the reason that she got it was a very close relationship with people within the DoD funding sphere. So, forming those relationships is very important. And so when I came here and started to get involved with the Combat Center, it also is becoming very clear that if I want to help my faculty get more involved with DoD, that those types of things are very important. And that I have to bring them in and have them network with the people that can help them get those grants.
Right. So it sounds like that former collaborator or current collaborator from Oregon was sort of your portal to other relationships and other inside information. And then here we come to the Combat Center where Annie is one of those people.
And it's fascinating to sit in those meetings and realize that, wait a minute, there are lots of places, especially in the anesthesiology realm, of collaborations. So it's just now trying to figure out how do we really start to define some projects that are going to work for the DoD.
One of the things that we're hoping to share with our listeners is, I know you're a master mentor. You're interested in mentoring. How do you advise mentees to find these people who can help connect them, and how would they do that? Right. For once you're on the faculty, you're a peer, right, and you just say, hey. Who are you? Oh, I'm me. Let's get coffee, whatever. But how do you actually help the mentee advocate for themselves in these ways?
So, now that I'm a faculty member and kind of one of the leaders in the department, I get emails probably every, couple a day or at least several a week from people who want to either come be a graduate student or a postdoc or whatever. And I can say that I immediately delete anything that looks like a form letter. Immediately delete anything without responding to somebody who doesn't know exactly my research, so hasn't looked up any of my papers and can't tell me why they would be interested in my lab. As I said before, I'm an electrophysiologist, and people will contact me saying that they're interested in behavior, or I'm an expert in genetics. It's just like, yeah, okay, and so the ones that seem like they are really interested, at least in the area of research that my lab does, I write back to them and say, this is an electrophysiology lab. I'm happy to train anybody who wants to learn how to do it, but this is what you will do. You won't be coming to my lab to do a behavior experiment. You won't be coming to my lab to do any kind of biochemical genetic experiment. you will be coming to learn electrophysiology.
Okay, so then if I got one of those emails from you, what response would you see that would make you continue the conversation? More than, oh yeah, that's me.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, they would have to respond about why they would want to learn electrophysiology and how that would help their career trajectory. And, somebody who puts that thought into it, I'm more than happy to have a Zoom conversation or bring them to campus to have a conversation about joining my lab.
If someone can articulate to you why they're interested in electrophysiology, but they have additional career goals and they think that's a small part of it, what would be your response?
So that's actually a really good question. So in my lab, so many of the people that I've mentored over the years have gone on to do other things. I'm more than happy to, support people in whatever career trajectory they want. Typically, though, electrophysiology takes 6 to 12 months to be proficient at. That if they really want to go do something like science policy, my lab is not.
That's a big
It's not a
commitment.
stepping stone.
But I've also, throughout my career, have been been a mentor to people who are in other labs. And I've developed a mentoring program through the society I belong to, which is ASPET, the American Society of Pharmacology and Experimental Therapeutics.
Trips off the tongue.
And the whole point of that is to allow people to get career development. They have a career development coach, but they also have like a group of 6 people from across the country in different labs across the country. And what it allows them to do is get some of that career development advice that maybe their direct mentor can't give them or doesn't want to give them because they want them to be in the lab. And so they can talk about issues that they're having as a mentee without having anybody from their university in the group. And so it's been really successful. And those people have gone on to do all kinds of different jobs, from government, from policy, from industry to different kinds of academic positions. And every year we get together, so all the past mentees, and there's a LinkedIn group. So there's a network of people who are now working across the country that these students and postdocs have access to. So it's been really fun to put that together, but they have to go through a 2-day training about implicit bias, mentoring, how you have difficult conversations.
Can I poke that a little bit? So I think one of the things that I've kind of experienced as I come back to academia is difficult conversations are very difficult, and that's a very hard
They're
skill
not my
set to
specialty
learn.
either.
Oh, nor are they mine. But can you elaborate a little bit on mentoring around how to have that type of conversation? I think that's a very rare skill set.
Yes, I think so. One of the most important concepts, and there's a group called SIMMER in Wisconsin that do a lot of training around mentoring for both mentors and mentees, is the idea of mentoring up. And that, mentees are not passive in the relationship with a mentor. Like, they shouldn't be passive. They should really, have conversations going into the mentorship about expectations. So when I first started my lab, I just expected people to work like I did, which I found very quickly was not the case. So now through that SIMMER group, they help to develop an expectation document. So I give that to people before they join the lab and say, this has to be, we can discuss certain items on this list if you would like. But really, this is what my expectations are if you join my lab, and what I will do for you and what I expect you to do for me. And it's been very helpful to start the conversation, those difficult conversations, with that document.
That's just excellent. We might call it lab management or mentorship or leadership, but being explicit about your expectations and going so far as to put it in writing and sharing it.
Share it.
I mean, that's just good business, right?
But I didn't know that. When I first started out, I knew nothing about it whatsoever. So it really took some, getting involved in these trainings to realize how important it was. So now I try to start people early at realizing they need that kind of thing.
I want to raise you on the idea that the mentee has a role to play. Literally at University of Colorado, I started and still help teach a mentoring training program, co-mentor, the Colorado Mentoring Training Program. And part of our philosophy, which we share on day one, is actually that the mentee is in charge of the relationship. The mentee is the leader, not the mentor. You're not wondering what the mentor's going to tell you to do. It's your job to figure out what you need because only you know what you need. Right. And then your job is to go ask for it. And then the mentor's role is to facilitate your wishes, hopes, and dreams. And it really puts the responsibility on the mentee for their own life, their own trajectory. And I think that in part we developed that because so many mentoring training programs only train the mentors.
Correct.
And
yes,
I
agree.
Well, if I just had the magic mentor, everything would be fine.
One of the things that I've noticed, and I think COVID played a role in it, but in the last few years, I see a lot of trainees coming in expecting everything from the mentor. And, I'm like, you came to graduate school. The point of graduate school is that you become an independent researcher. So that means you can't be doing everything I do. I can't tell you everything to do. This is something that you have to figure out for yourself. What are your main interests? How are you going to get there is completely up to you. I find there's a lot of resistance to that. And so trying to think of ways with some of my collaborators on the mentoring side is how do we break that habit?
There's a coaching phrase that, an executive coaching phrase that you say, you want to roll through the resistance, right? You know you're pushing back, I'm pushing back on you, pushing back, and we're just going to keep rolling. I agree. I think we could definitely talk about some of the barriers that COVID put up that I think it's gonna be some time to overcome. However, I will say that shift in mindset from a training situation, maybe an undergrad, where the program is laid out from A to Z. You take these courses, you do these things, you check the boxes, you're done. It's totally unambiguous. Exactly. And you don't actually get much say in the matter. And then you go to a program like graduate school, and I think many people think, well, it's more of the same. And for certain, in academic medicine, you find somebody's been in undergrad, then medical school, then residency. They've been told exactly what to do and how to be successful. And then they say, oh, I want to be an academic researcher. And they say, what would you like to study? What paper would you like to write? What grant will you write? Who would you work with? And they, oh my God.
I actually do find that, now working with clinician scientists or clinicians who are interested in doing some research and starting and not knowing exactly where to start or how to do it.
I think for PhDs, we get at least one deep experience in that as you decide what subfield are you going to focus on, what dissertation topic will there be, who will be on your committee, where will you present? Like we've all done it one time, not like you're so great at it, but at least once where the physicians don't get quite so much freedom. What were you?
I was gonna ask, one of the things that I feel I've seen somewhat post-COVID is mentees being afraid of critical thinking, afraid to say something that might not be right. How do you foster those critical thinking skills and kind of balance that with fear of failure. Because I think your example with the clinician researchers being a little bit different than PhD researchers is spot on, because a clinician is presented with a problem. The patient presents with signs, symptoms, they can do a physical, they can find evidence, and then they go and figure out what's going on. But as a researcher, you have to figure out what your problem is first, right? Like, what do I want? How do I critically think about a problem? And so how do you kind of build that critical thinking in your mentees?
Working on it right now. It's not easy. I mean, I do think there's a different personality trait that works for being a researcher versus being someone like an MD who, everything's kind of cut and dry. Like, there are these things that you need to work on. And it has to do with being okay not knowing. And being interested in trying to figure it out, but being okay with not being an expert at all things. And I found, even as I was teaching undergrads, if I said that I didn't know something, I would get marked down on my annual review that she doesn't know everything. And I'd start to laugh, and I was like, okay, nope, very true. I do not know everything. And so you realize very early on that some people are not okay with that, and they're not going to make a good researcher.
Well, yes, let me build on that, because I do recall for several years I was a faculty member in the School of Pharmacy, and I taught PharmD students, and I would be the one to introduce them to the notion that, in fact, we do not have all the answers. And many clinicians, certainly in their early training, it's presented as if it's all quite, black and white. You do this and then you see this. And indeed, it's gray. Whether you're realizing that the evidence doesn't pertain to every case, or the evidence was flawed, or frankly, we don't know. So,
and there are some the ones that'll make great clinician scientists are the ones that want to question, like, why is this patient different than these, and not responding to this medication,
right?
Rather than just be like, well, I'm going to just give them another medication,
right?
They're not interested in why.
Yeah, I do think there's an intellectual maturity that comes, and some get it faster than others, and some simply will not get there. And you're right, but I think the people, whatever your background, who are always like, why? The people who are always going to that place in their mind do have a good affinity for being researchers. Yeah. This is really great. Before we let you go, we could talk all day. One of the things Annie and I were really interested in learning about is what is your experience of being a woman leader in science, in medicine, in, what might be considered a male-dominated field?
So, lucky for me, as an electrophysiologist, and when I started as an electrophysiologist, it was a male-dominated field for sure. My very first study section, there were 30 men and 3 females. And 2 of the other females were behavior people that they put on the panels to be able to review the grants. And so, I've been in that kind of situation most of my life. And it is interesting. I do find, or back then when I was starting out, I found that I was talked over quite a bit. And it happens, even paper reviews. As a postdoc, I got a review, these people shouldn't be doing this work. That was the only sentence review. The other review was actually very insightful and helped us make the paper better, and it went into Neuron, which is a very high impact. So, whoever that person was,
they were wrong.
They were wrong. And so you see those instances along the way. I think I'm a very shy person. I think I've learned to not be so shy, along the way, and becoming a leader is really important. It took a lot of my courage to even apply for the vice chair of research position that I now have, because I was like, I don't know how to be a leader. I'm just do my science, So I actually looked up.
Let me ask you then, what did push you over the edge to apply? Which, of course, you succeeded. But who did somebody?
I had friends on this campus who had sent me that job ad and said, you'd be perfect for this. Mm-hmm. So it was peers who said, you should really think about doing this. That made me do that. So I thought, well, that and my kids had gone to college, and there was no reason not to change or try something new. Try something new and different. I was very intrigued about the ability or the opportunity to work in the anesthesiology department and have that access to clinicians who were seeing patients that would have pain problems and the different problems that were really important for my research. So they have a great cannabis group here, very, very top-notch group of people who can analyze cannabinoids and metabolites of cannabis, and I think that was very appealing as well. But I looked up some books on leadership and realized, wait a minute, I do all these things already. So I was like, okay, I think I can do this.
Nice.
Is it that kind of false self-perception of not being a leader, maybe? Full disclosure, I'm going through some executive coaching right now, and I'm learning that especially younger women have this false self-perception of how others view them as not in a leadership role when they actually are. And so embracing the fact that you are already doing all of these things that leaders do.
For me, it was because I chose when I had my children to not do this typical faculty path. So I actually stayed at OHSU while I took a small position at Washington State University teaching. I thought I'd love teaching undergrads because both my parents were involved with teaching. I love developing the courses. I hated teaching it the second time. So as soon as I got a chance to move my research lab back to OHSU, I took it. But it was one of those pathways that, I didn't go do the talk search and do any kind of faculty search. I never applied for a job until I applied here. So that was a very kind of circuitous path. Which made me feel like I wasn't one of the leaders in terms of a faculty position type career.
Well, that little story just reveals some of your leadership qualities, in fact, because, some of it is exploring what might be interesting, even if it means moving your lab, and then you try it and you go, no, there's some of this is great, some not so great. Just like keep rolling, keep building on it. And I want to pick up on something you said. I think, and you specifically referred to young women, but I think it can be any age. I do think some people who start out with the idea that leadership is positional leadership, that you had to be the assistant vice chair or the research director of whatever, that somehow the title conveys leadership, and therefore the only leadership that's happening is somebody with a title, and like if you're just getting going, what do you have to do anything? Except we all know that, for instance, I will say I've been on committees many, many times where there's the chair of the committee and then there's the one that is actually running the committee, the voice that will shut it all down or set the tone or create the direction. And so that is the thought leader, the influential leader, not necessarily the positional leader. And I generally think you can be a thought leader at any age and stage, and that's your goal, is to find your voice in something, anything, the smallest thing, it doesn't matter. And that might be being the thought leader in your scientific area or in your group or in your department or whatever. And that's the way that I think people observe you behaving and they say, you would be really great at this because you're doing the thing.
I mean, I guess one piece of advice I would give people, because one thing I do see, there are lots more opportunities, a lot more even online resources for learning, for career development and types of things. But you got to listen to your gut. You got to follow what, if an opportunity comes up and it seems interesting, just do it. You know, whether it's moving across to countries somewhere else or trying something new, because yes, that sometimes the plan that you make for yourself isn't really the most interesting one. So don't be afraid to just try something different.
Take a chance on yourself. You're a good bet, right?
It's worked. It's been fun. Yeah. I'm not sure I would change anything that I've in my career.
That's awesome. Any last points of wisdom on?
I don't think so. I just love the parting words. Don't be afraid of change. Because I think we were, before we started our day, we were talking a little bit about how folks who set a course and don't know how to deviate are often folks who fail or who crumble in the face of failure. And so I love your guidance to not be afraid to take those chances.
I'm just going to emphasize one thing that you said, which is trust your gut. I am also someone who I do highly value my intuition. You know, I think it's some sense of processing that you can't quite put your finger on, but like that knowing is, I feel I follow my gut a lot, and generally it's right. So I think it's a good practice for your life to trust your instincts. Don't try to talk yourself out of it. Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much, Susie.
Thank you for having me. It's fun.